Hi friends. Please subscribe and help me get my first 1,000 subscribers. It's one click for you, but for me it's a huge encouragement and motivation. Thank you to everyone who has already subscribed. I hope you enjoy this story. Let's go. The summer evening was sticky and oppressive, typical for Boston in July. The humidity hung heavy over the Back Bay brownstones, refusing to break. David sat on the plush leather sofa, an iPad resting in his hands, aimlessly scrolling through websites to kill time. Sarah had been on vacation with her girlfriends for the second week now, and the house felt unnervingly quiet without her. He was swiping through pages without really reading, his mind on autopilot, until a flashy banner ad caught his eye: Naturist Pleasure Spa, Escape Reality. Well, one open tab never killed anyone, he thought with a dry chuckle and tapped the link. Landing on the site, David skimmed the descriptions of the live streams: exotic treatments, private massages, total relaxation. It all looked like standard clickbait. But something in his gut twisted, a primal instinct urging him to scroll down just a little further. In the premium section, a thumbnail flashed by. A face he knew better than his own. David froze. It was her. His wife. Sarah. She was listed under the alias Jasmine, dressed in lingerie so revealing it left nothing to the imagination. He sat paralyzed, as if the earth had stopped spinning on its axis. No way. He whispered, his voice cracking, but his eyes were glued to the retina display. A high-pitched ringing filled his ears, drowning out the hum of the city outside. David paid the access fee, his fingers stiff, and opened the video stream. The image filled the screen in high definition. Sarah was lounging on a king-sized bed, smiling up at Raoul, a guy covered in ink, who was leaning over her. The camera angle shifted, and a second man, Simon, handed her a crystal flute of champagne. They were laughing, trading dirty jokes and intimate glances, acting as if they were the only people in the world. How? Why did not I see this coming? His thoughts were racing like trapped animals. He knew he could not just close the tab and pretend this was a bad dream. He had to know the extent of it. David upgraded to the full subscription, unlocking the archive. His hands were trembling uncontrollably as he clicked on the first recording. Night 1. Sarah and Raoul. Smiles, playful touching, zero hesitation. David clenched his jaw so hard he thought his teeth might shatter. The next video, the same scene, but now Simon was in the mix. Waves of pure rage crashed over him, threatening to pull him under. He stood up, pacing the living room floor like a caged tiger, then forced himself back onto the couch to keep watching. Another recording, their third evening. This time, Sarah and Raoul were smoking cigars, chatting lazily as if this was their normal Tuesday night routine. Suddenly, Raoul laughed and asked, "So you think your husband is ever gonna catch on?" Sarah narrowed her eyes, a smirk playing on her lips. "Please, he does not have a clue. Look, I love him. This is just a way to blow off steam." The words felt like a physical blow to David's gut. Just a way to blow off steam? He made a fist, his knuckles turning white, unable to look away. In the final scene, Sarah looked peaceful, a glass of wine in hand. She laughed, winking at Simon. "You know, sometimes nights like this actually remind me how much I love my husband." David felt something dark and cold bloom in his chest. It was not just pain or resentment, it was the sensation of his reality collapsing. Everything he believed in was a lie. He closed the video player, leaned his head back against the sofa, and stared into the void. His hands shook, his breathing shallow and rapid. What now? That was the only thought looping in his mind. He knew the trust was dead. And something inside him had fundamentally snapped. He stood up, walked to the kitchen, and poured himself a stiff glass of bourbon. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it did nothing to numb the storm raging inside. He had to act. Now. Immediately. He grabbed his iPhone and started typing a text. "Sarah, I know everything. Do not even try to spin this. You betrayed me. I'm filing for divorce." His thumb hovered over the blue arrow. He held his breath and pressed it, feeling a jolt of adrenaline shoot through his veins. The message was delivered. There was no turning back. Now, all he could do was wait. A fleeting thought crossed his mind. Maybe there's an explanation? But his common sense screamed that this was just his brain trying to protect him from the inevitable. The silence in the room was deafening. David walked to the window, looking out into the dark courtyard, and felt a cold resolve hardening within him. Their entire marriage was a sham. And for that lie, there would be a price to pay. At that moment, his phone buzzed on the counter. A new message from Sarah. "David, what are you talking about? I do not understand." But he was not going to reply. He had said everything that needed to be said. David sat at the mahogany desk in his home office, turning a flash drive over and over in his hands. The room was silent, save for the rhythmic whir of an old desk fan. In front of him lay 4 copies of the video evidence proving Sarah's infidelity. He locked one in his wall safe and packed the others, ready to hand them over to his lawyer to start the divorce proceedings. But even the cold, calculated plan he had formed could not suppress the agony tearing him apart. He dialed the number for his attorney, Michael. "We need to discuss my divorce filings immediately," David said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Of course, David. Stop by tomorrow morning," Michael answered, his tone breezy and unconcerned. The next day, David drove downtown to Michael's office in the financial district. The corridor screamed corporate success, with polished floors and brass nameplates, but the moment he stepped inside, the vibe was off. He was not greeted by Michael, but by a secretary with a plastered-on smile. "Please, head into the conference room. Michael will be right with you," she said. David walked into the room and stopped dead in his tracks. Sarah was there. And sitting right next to her, in a $3,000 suit, sat Michael, arms crossed, leaning confidently against the table. David realized instantly, he had been set up. "What are you doing here?" David snapped, staring daggers at Sarah. "We're here to discuss the best way to settle this matter," Michael replied calmly. David felt the anger boil over, like someone had dumped a bucket of scalding water on him. He grabbed the folder of documents he brought and slammed it onto the table in front of Michael. "You were supposed to represent my interests, not jump into bed with the opposition." His voice shook with fury. Michael did not flinch. "I have a conflict of interest here, David. Sarah is a significant client, and her family is tied to the business assets that would be reallocated in the event of a divorce. It's strictly business." David barely stopped himself from taking a swing at the lawyer. "Business?" he hissed. "My life is just a transaction to you?" Sarah sat silently, but her eyes held that same smug self-assurance she always had. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a soft, manipulative purr. "David, let us not make this messy. We can still resolve this amicably." But David was not listening anymore. He stood up abruptly, snatched his papers back, and walked out, slamming the glass door so hard the frame rattled. His faith in people had evaporated completely. He knew he was going to have to fight this war alone. He pulled out his phone and dialed Chris, an old college buddy who had recently opened his own law practice in South Boston. "Chris, I need a favor. A big one. Urgent." By the next day, David was sitting in Chris's modest office, laying out the entire story, from the first video to Michael's betrayal. "I see and not let them walk away from this," he finished, his hands balled into fists. "I need terms they see a not wiggle out of." Chris nodded, looking at his friend with grim understanding. "Do not worry, David. We're going to nail them to the wall." The meeting with Sarah was scheduled for the following day at Chris's office. David sat at the table, nervously tapping his fingers on the lid of his briefcase, where the flash drives with the evidence were stored. When Sarah walked in, she looked confident, but David caught a flicker of tension in her eyes. "Shall we begin?" Chris smiled coldly, spreading the documents out before him. Sarah sat opposite David, crossing her arms defensively. "David, do you really want to burn everything down? I have not done anything to change how I feel about us. Those were just moments of weakness." David slowly pulled one of the flash drives out of his pocket and slid it across the table. "Is that what you call them? Moments of weakness?" Her gaze faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered her composure. "It was a mistake. But I love you, David. You have to understand. Understand." He let out a harsh laugh. "You want me to understand that you were hooking up with Raoul and Simon, and then coming home to me like nothing happened?" Sarah lowered her eyes but remained silent. Tell me the truth, he demanded, his voice hard as steel. All this time when you said you loved me, was that a lie too?
No.
Her voice cracked. I really do love you. But it's not what you think. It was just. Save the lies, David stood up, casting an icy glare at her. If you actually loved me, you would not be hiding behind deceit. We are done. Chris gathered the paperwork and handed David the documents to sign. We are filing for divorce, Chris said, looking directly at Sarah. And all the terms will be exactly as we discussed.
No compromises.
Sarah jumped up, furious. You see not do this. David scoffed and pushed the briefcase toward her. Try and stop me. She froze for a moment, realizing she had no cards left to play. David walked out without looking back. This time, he was ready to fight to the bitter end. The night was unseasonably warm. After locking the final copy of the hard drive in his wall safe, David headed for the kitchen. He needed a stiff pour of whiskey to dull the sharp edges of his anger and exhaustion. He knew there were legal battles ahead, but for now, all he wanted was 5 minutes of silence. He sat on the living room sofa, staring out into the darkness of the yard, when something caught his eye. Headlights swept across the driveway. That was odd. No one was expected this late. He stood up, set his glass on the coffee table, and approached the front door with caution. Cracking the door open, David peered outside. A dark figure was standing in the shadows of the porch. Who's there? He called out, but there was no answer. The shadow lunged forward. Before David could react, something heavy and cold cracked against his skull. A blinding white light exploded behind his eyes, and then the world dissolved into infinite blackness. David woke to the rhythmic beeping of a monitor somewhere to his left. His body felt like it was encased in lead, and even the smallest movement sent a jolt of sharp pain radiating through him. He tried to turn his head, but immediately regretted it. A spike of agony drilled into his temples, forcing him to squeeze his eyes shut. Can you hear me? A soft voice asked. He peeled his eyes open, his vision blurry, and made out a nurse hovering over him. Welcome back, David. You at Mass General. You were brought in after an assault. He tried to speak, but his throat felt like he had swallowed a handful of sand. The nurse guided a straw to his lips. Small sips, she instructed gently. What happened? He rasped. The nurse hesitated for a beat before answering. You were found on your front porch. You have a severe concussion, several broken ribs, and a punctured lung. It looks like someone beat you pretty badly. The words hit David like an ice bath. He closed his eyes, trying to stitch together the fragmented memories. He remembered opening the door, the shadow moving, and then, nothing. A few minutes later, a doctor in a white coat walked in. Good afternoon, David. We glad you awake. You lucky. If the paramedics had not arrived when they did, we might be having a very different conversation. David nodded slightly, feeling a toxic mix of fear and rage bubbling in his chest. My house, is it okay? Police are already processing the scene. They said it was a robbery. They tried to get a statement yesterday when you drifted in and out, but you were not making much sense, the doctor replied. Once you a little more stable, the detectives want to talk. The next day, 2 detectives, Carter and Robbins, entered the room. They looked all business, wearing cheap suits and tired expressions. David, we know you hurting, but we need to ask a few questions. What do you remember about the attack? Carter asked, pulling out a notepad. David closed his eyes, replaying the tape in his mind. I heard a noise outside. Opened the door. Saw a shadow. Then a hit, and lights out. Carter exchanged a glance with Robbins. Do you have any idea who it might have been? David hesitated. A thought had been forming in the back of his mind, dark and terrible, but now it seemed like the only logical answer. I suspect my wife's brothers, Jake and Ryan. The detectives raised their eyebrows. Why them? They knew about my plans to file for divorce and that their family assets would take a hit. We've had serious conflicts about it, David answered, his voice gaining strength. Robbins nodded, scribbling furiously. We'll check their alibis. We also need to go over a list of missing items to figure out what the perps were looking for. My documents, the drives, Everything was there, David whispered, a sudden wave of panic washing over him. Did you check your safe? Carter asked cautiously. David shook his head.
No.
But if they found it? We'll send a team to verify, Robbins promised. Days later, when David was finally discharged, he returned to a crime scene. His home was trashed. Drawers were pulled out and dumped on the floor, books were swept off shelves, and frames were smashed. With trembling hands, he walked to the built-in bookcase and triggered the hidden panel. He let out a breath he did not know he was holding. The safe was untouched. The drives and documents were right where he left them. But the relief was short-lived. David knew Sarah's brothers would not stop here. The stakes were too high for them to just walk away. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began to formulate his next move. His hands were still shaking, but now it was not just pain, it was resolve. He knew this war had only just begun. David sat hunched over his desk, eyes glued to the security footage. Familiar figures moved across the screen. His heart hammered against his ribs as the resolution cleared, Jake and Ryan. They were prowling toward the house like wolves, arrogant and sloppy. David clenched his fists, so hard his nails dug into his palms. They knew he was ending the marriage, and they had decided to take him out of the equation to save the family fortune. On the screen, Jake approached the door first. Without hesitation, he swung a baton at David's head. Then, both brothers stepped over his unconscious body and began tearing the house apart. They were hunting for something specific. The drives. The leverage that could nuke their careers and bank accounts. David watched, nausea and fury fighting for dominance in his gut. He had barely survived, and these people needed to pay. He paused the video and stood up. The room spun slightly, a reminder of the concussion, but he steadied himself. He was done being the victim. He needed a plan. Step 1 was to figure out the ownership structure of the family business. David opened financial databases and went to work. Hours later, he had the picture. Jake and Ryan held a combined 48% of the stock. The remaining 52% still belonged to their father, Mr. Green, who had famously refused to hand over full control to his sons. The next day, David met Chris for lunch. Chris, I need to move fast and quiet. I want to buy out the old man's shares. I'll pay whatever he wants. Chris nodded, seeing the cold fire in his friend's eyes. If Green agrees to sell, I can have the paperwork ready in a week. David knew that Mr. Green had no great love for his son's incompetence. Convincing the patriarch to cash out turned out to be easier than expected. They read disappointments, the old man grumbled, signing the transfer documents with a heavy hand. If you think you can clean up their mess, take the damn thing. A few days later, the deal was closed. David was the majority shareholder of the Green family empire. He now held the keys to their destruction. David sat at the head of the long conference table in the expansive boardroom. Everything about the space, from the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston skyline to the cold imported marble floors, screamed of the Green family's old money legacy. He used to be a part of this world. Now, the atmosphere had shifted. He was moments away from the final act, total liberation from Sarah and her toxic family. The process had taken longer than he anticipated, but every step of this retribution had been calculated down to the inch. He looked down at his hands. Resting in his palm was a black flash drive. It contained the video, the undeniable proof of who had ordered the hit on him. This was his nuclear option, and today, he was going to detonate it. The double doors swung open. Sarah, Jake, and Ryan walked in. Sarah looked wrecked, her face was gaunt, and the designer makeup could not hide the dark circles under her eyes. She was trying to project confidence, but her posture gave her away. Jake and Ryan were tense, moving like cornered animals waiting for a trap to spring. David gave them a curt nod, but his eyes were dead cold. He did not look at them as family anymore, he barely looked at them as people. "Have a seat," he said calmly. Sarah sat first, followed reluctantly by her brothers. A suffocating silence filled the room. No one dared to speak first. Finally, Sarah cracked. "David, this has to stop. We need to talk." He nodded slowly, his gaze locked on hers. "You rewrite. It ends today. David reached for the laptop sitting next to him and plugged in the flash drive. Jake and Ryan exchanged a nervous glance but kept their mouths shut. Sarah, noticing the drive, stiffened. "What is that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly as she tried to maintain composure. "This," David said, his voice dropping to absolute zero, "is proof of exactly who was behind the attack on me." He hit the spacebar. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life. Sarah's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. Jake turned the color of ash. Ryan shifted in his chair, looking at the door as if calculating the distance to freedom. But there was no way out of this room. "That's impossible," Ryan blurted out, jumping to his feet. "You set this up. We did not do that." "Sit down," David commanded. He did not yell. He did not need to. The authority in his voice was absolute. Jake sat frozen, staring at the table. He was smart enough to know that denial was useless. Sarah shot a quick look at her brothers, and her expression went blank, as if she was seeing them for the first time, really seeing them. She took a deep, shaky breath. "David." Her voice was a whisper. "Please, it is not what you think. We can explain this." "Explain." David let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You know what happens next, Sarah?" He slid a heavy stack of documents across the mahogany table. "Now that I hold the controlling interest, I have finalized the sale of the family business. Everything you thought you owned now belongs to Cargill. And you have your brothers to thank for that." Sarah stared at the paperwork in disbelief, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "You see, not do this." "I already did," David cut her off. Jake finally stood up, his face twisted in rage. "Have you lost your mind?" he screamed. "This is our life. Our heritage. You have no right to destroy us." "I have every right, Jake," David replied with a terrifyingly calm smile. "You gave me that right the moment you decided to bash my head in." Ryan, realizing the game was truly lost, stood up abruptly and headed for the door, but David stopped him with a few words. "You think this is over? You have no idea what's coming next." Ryan froze, his shoulders slumping in defeat. Jake stood there, fists clenched, impotent in his fury. Sarah sat motionless, looking like she had severed ties with reality. Her breathing became erratic, her eyes wide and unseeing. Then she stood up unsteadily, swayed for a second, and before anyone could react, she collapsed to the floor, out cold. David did not move to help her. He watched the scene with detached indifference. He looked at Jake and Ryan. "Call 911, he said, his tone clinical. As Jake scrambled for his phone, David gathered his papers and stood up. Sarah was still lying on the floor, unconscious, but he felt nothing. She was just a ghost of the woman he had once loved. All that remained was emptiness and betrayal. When David reached the heavy double doors, he turned back one last time. "I'm done with you. Now you can live with the consequences." He walked out, leaving Jake and Ryan in the boardroom with their fallen sister. They were left alone in the ruins of their lives. And David, closing the door behind him, finally felt the weight lift off his shoulders. He stepped out of the building. The streets of Boston seemed brighter, the air crisper. The silence in his head was finally peaceful. He was free, and the future belonged to him. The flashing lights of the Boston police cruisers painted the sides of the downtown skyscrapers in rhythmic bursts of blue and white as David walked toward his car. He did not look back as the paramedics rushed into the lobby, followed closely by a phalanx of uniformed officers. He had already forwarded the video file to the district attorney's office. The evidence was irrefutable. The fallout was swift and brutal. With the video of the assault playing on every local news station, Jake and Ryan did not stand a chance. Their high-priced defense attorneys tried to cut a deal, but the public outcry was too loud, and the evidence was too graphic. The charges were heavy: aggravated assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, conspiracy, and attempted murder. 6 months later, David sat in the back of the courtroom, watching the final act of the tragedy unfold. Jake and Ryan stood before the judge, their arrogant designer suits replaced by standard-issue jumpsuits. They looked smaller now, stripped of their family name and their fortune. "For the crimes committed," the judge announced, her voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls, "I sentence you both to a minimum of 12 years in state prison at M.
C.I.
Cedar Junction. The bang of the gavel sounded like a gunshot. Jake slumped forward, putting his head in his hands, while Ryan just stared blankly at the wall. They were being sent to a maximum security facility where the Green family name meant absolutely nothing. As for the business, Cargill wasted no time. They stripped the company for parts, absorbing the valuable assets and liquidating the rest. The Green Enterprises sign was removed from the headquarters less than 2 weeks after the takeover. The legacy that Jake and Ryan had tried to kill for was erased as if it had never existed. But the cruelest fate was reserved for Sarah. She recovered physically from her collapse, but her life as she knew it was over. The divorce went through swiftly. With the proof of her infidelity and her brother's criminal actions, the prenuptial agreement was enforced to the letter. She received no alimony, and her shares in the company were worthless after the liquidation. David saw her one last time, from a distance, about a year later. He was leaving a coffee shop in the Seaport district when he spotted a woman wiping down tables at a generic chain restaurant across the street. She looked older, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, wearing a stained uniform. It was Sarah. The woman who used to spend thousands of dollars on a single handbag was now working for minimum wage, struggling to pay rent on a small apartment in Revere. She looked up through the glass window and their eyes met for a fleeting second. David saw regret, deep and hollow, swimming in her gaze. She took a step forward, as if to wave or call out to him, but stopped. She knew. She had gambled everything on a lie, and she had lost. David did not stop. He did not smile, and he did not gloat. He simply put on his sunglasses, turned the corner, and walked toward the harbor. The ocean breeze smelled of salt and freedom. He checked his watch. He had a meeting with a real estate agent about a cottage on Cape Cod. He was finally building a life based on truth, and for the first time in years, the future looked bright. The slate was clean. The debt was paid. And David never looked back. And that concludes our story today. Thank you for watching to the end. If you liked it, please give it a like and leave a comment. Also, we are always happy to discuss any comments you may have. See you in the next video.